Law is a reflection of society. It reveals its values, fears, ambitions, and, strangely enough, its collective foolishness. While most laws are created with good intentions, to establish order, protect citizens, and ensure justice, history is filled with examples of legislators creating rules that today evoke only bewilderment and laughter. These laws are not just amusing curiosities. They are invaluable artifacts that allow us to peer into the minds of people from the past and understand that what seemed logical to them is, to us, the height of absurdity. Let's dive into this legal panopticon and examine the strangest, most illogical, and downright stupid laws ever passed by humanity. Part 1. The Morality Police. Laws that invaded personal life and appearance. Controlling the appearance and behavior of citizens has always been a favorite tool of power. Such laws were rarely effective, but they always perfectly demonstrated the paranoia and prejudices of the ruling class. The beard tax, when your face was state property. Imagine having to pay a tax for the right to wear a beard. It sounds like a bad joke, but for men in 18th century Russia and 16th century England, it was a harsh reality. The Russian version, Peter the Great, 1698. For Peter the Great, a beard was not just facial hair, but a symbol of everything old, backward, and un-European. As part of his sweeping westernization campaign, he introduced a tax on beards. This was not merely a way to fill the treasury, it was an act of cultural violence. Want to look like an old-fashioned nobleman? Pay up. The sums were colossal and depended on social class. Courtiers and officials were hit with a staggering 600 rubles a year, a huge amount of money. Merchants with 100 and peasants with 2 small coins upon entering a city. As proof of payment, a special copper token, the beard token, was issued, which had to be carried at all times. In essence, it was a license to wear one's own face. The law was not so much stupid in its goal, Peter knew what he was doing, as in its method, forcing men to shave by hitting them in the wallet. The English version, Henry VIII, 1535. In England, the motivation was far more prosaic: money. King Henry VIII, who himself wore a full beard, imposed a tax on everyone who followed his example. The tax depended on the beard owner's social status. His daughter, Elizabeth I, went even further and introduced a tax on any beard that had been growing for more than 2 weeks. This law was a classic example of fiscal absurdity. A natural biological process was being taxed. Sumptuary laws. Don't you dare dress better than me. For centuries, from ancient Rome to the Renaissance, laws were in effect across Europe, regulating what people could wear, eat, and even how they could celebrate. On the surface, it was a fight against excess, but in reality, it was a desperate attempt by the elite to preserve the social hierarchy. The logic was simple. If a merchant can afford the same purple cloak as a duke, how can you tell one from the other? This undermined the foundations of a class-based society. The laws reached ridiculous extremes. In England, under Edward III, commoners were forbidden from wearing clothes made of silk or fur. In 14th century Florence, a law limited the length of women's dress trains and the number of buttons on a dress. In Rome, there were strict rules about who was allowed to wear clothes of certain colors. Purple, for example, was reserved almost exclusively for the emperor. Why were these laws foolish? First, they were practically impossible to enforce. This created a huge black market for fabrics and clothing. Second, they stifled the economy by restricting artisans and merchants. Third, they were deeply hypocritical. The nobility demanded modesty from others while drowning in luxury themselves. The Devil's Fork. Satan's tool at your table. Today, the fork is a common piece of cutlery, but in medieval Europe, its appearance caused a genuine moral scandal. When a Byzantine princess brought a fork to Venice in the 11th century as part of her dowry, the clergy was horrified. Priests declared it an instrument of the devil. The reasoning was ironclad by the standards of the time. God gave man fingers to eat with. Using an artificial implement was an insult to the divine plan. The shape of the fork resembled the devil's miniature horns or pitchfork. When the princess died of the plague, one Holy Father declared that it was divine punishment for her sinful use of the fork. For centuries, the fork was considered a sign of effeminacy, godlessness, and foreign influence. Men who used a fork risked being accused of being womanly. While a formal law was not passed everywhere, public and ecclesiastical condemnation was more powerful than any edict, halting progress in table etiquette and hygiene for hundreds of years. Part 2. The Economics of Absurdity. Taxes that destroyed what they were meant to replenish. If there are two eternal things, they are death and taxes. And while death is straightforward, with taxes, legislators have shown miraculous ingenuity, at times driving the situation to complete madness. The window tax, pay for sunlight. In 1696, England introduced what was perhaps one of the most devastating taxes in history, the window tax. The idea seemed brilliant to the government. It was a progressive property tax. The richer a person, the bigger their house, and therefore the more windows they had. Plus, it was easy to administer. The tax inspector didn't need to enter the house, they just had to count the windows from the outside. The consequences were catastrophic. People began to brick up their windows en masse to avoid the tax. New houses were built with a minimal number of windows or none at all. This led to dwellings, especially those of the poor, becoming dark, damp, and unventilated boxes. This law became a true enemy of public health. The lack of sunlight and fresh air spurred the spread of diseases like typhus, cholera, and rickets. Doctors and reformers fought for decades to repeal the tax, calling it a tax on light and air. It was finally abolished in 1851, 156 years after it was introduced. It is a perfect example of how a law that looks good on paper can lead to a real humanitarian catastrophe. The cowardice tax, or scutage, officially buy your way out of war. In medieval England, every knight was obligated to serve the king in the army for a certain number of days each year. However, for many feudal lords, managing their lands was more important and profitable than participating in dubious military campaigns. King Henry I found a solution and introduced scutage, or shield money. It was a tax that allowed a knight to legally buy his way out of military service. At first glance, it was a win-win. The knight stayed home, and the king used the collected money to hire professional mercenaries who were often more effective in battle. The foolishness of this law became apparent under King John Lackland, the very same one who became the antagonist in the legends of Robin Hood. He turned this tax into an instrument of extortion. John levied it 11 times in the 16 years of his reign, often even when there was no war. He used it to fill his treasury and put pressure on the barons. It was the abuse of this tax that became one of the main causes of the revolt of the barons and the signing of the Magna Carta in 1215, which limited the king's power. Thus, the cowardice tax led to the birth of one of the most important documents in the history of human rights. The tax on playing cards and hats, a bureaucratic nightmare. In the 18th century, the British government, desperately in need of money to wage wars, decided to tax luxury items. Hats, gloves, perfumes, and playing cards were targeted. With cards, it was relatively simple. A special government stamp was placed on the ace of spades. Forging this stamp was punishable by death. But with the hat tax, 1784, a true bureaucratic nightmare began. Hat sellers had to buy a license. A special paper stamp was glued inside every hat sold. The price of the stamp depended on the value of the hat. To evade the tax, manufacturers began calling their products head coverings, but not hats. The government had to issue a special act providing a precise legal definition of a hat. It was an endless game of cat and mouse between the state and business, which created a mountain of pointless paperwork and did not bring significant revenue to the treasury. Part 3. When logic sleeps, laws based on superstition and sheer madness. Some laws are so irrational that they can only be explained by the worldview of their era, a mixture of deep religiosity, superstition, and a complete lack of scientific knowledge. Animal trials. Pig, take the stand. In medieval Europe, it was a completely normal practice to put animals on trial. These were not metaphorical trials. They were full-fledged legal proceedings with lawyers, witnesses, and jurors. Animals were accused of crimes, ranging from murder to crop damage. In 1386, in Falaise, France, a pig was put on trial for having fatally wounded a child. The pig was found guilty. Before its execution by hanging, it was dressed in human clothing. In the 15th century, in Basel, Switzerland, a rooster was tried for the unnatural crime of laying an egg. This was considered the work of the devil, as it was believed a basilisk could hatch from such an egg. The rooster was burned at the stake along with the egg. It wasn't just individual animals that were tried, but entire species. There are known cases of church courts excommunicating locusts or weevils for destroying fields. Why did this happen? In the medieval mind, the world was imbued with a divine order. A crime committed by an animal disrupted this order. The trial was a way to ritually restore justice and harmony. Animals, it was believed, could be possessed by the devil and therefore held moral responsibility. Today this seems barbaric, but for the people of that time, it was an act of restoring cosmic balance. Do not die in Parliament, the law that is impossible to break and to enforce. One of the most famous absurd laws in Great Britain states that it is illegal to die in the Palace of Westminster, where Parliament meets. It has still not been formally repealed. The reason for this law is surprisingly pragmatic. The Palace of Westminster has the status of a royal palace. According to an old custom, anyone who dies in a royal palace is entitled to a state funeral at the Crown's expense. This law was devised to avoid such unforeseen and costly expenses. If someone became ill inside the Parliament building, they would immediately be carried outside the palace grounds so that they would legally die on the street. It is a perfect example of how bureaucratic logic gives birth to utterly ridiculous and unenforceable rules.